Hello, everybody. We're going to get started here in just a couple minutes. We're waiting for a few more people. We had 35 RSVPs, but I also know how life is this time of year. So we'll just give it a couple minutes and see how many more people are actually going to pop in, and then we'll get started. So feel free to listen to the music, grab a drink, grab some dinner, do whatever you need to do. If you want to turn your camera on, you are more than welcome to turn your camera on today as well. Just get yourself in a comfortable spot. We'll get started in just a minute. As soon as John Mayer is done singing and reminding us to say what we need to say, we'll get going. All right. He is wrapping up his vocals, so let's get started. I'll continue to monitor the participants and let people in as we go as needed. So, first of all, thank you so much for joining on a random Wednesday night in the fall. I know that life is busy right now. I know you've got 1,000 other places that maybe you'd rather be, or maybe some of you are multitasking right now. Maybe you're driving home, maybe you're sitting at a soccer field. Regardless of what you're doing, I appreciate that you're here. I appreciate that you are going to be engaged in this. During our time tonight, you're going to hear me just talking at you quite a bit, which I apologize. Typically, when I'm meeting with people and doing things like this, it is way more interactive. But 90 minutes is nowhere near enough time for us to cover all the things that we need to cover. So I'm going to be going extremely quickly. You'll see me just flying through some slides, giving you a preview of some things. Know full well that we can expand on anything that I don't cover. At the end, I want to make sure that there is time for Q&A. I want to make sure that if you have specific things that you want to address, that I leave some time for you to get things covered as well. Or we can follow up when we're all said and done. All my contact info is there on the screen right now. Hopefully you can see it. Feel free to send me a text, even tonight if you want to. Email me. You can find my website. Whatever it is that you want to do to get in touch with me, feel free if we don't cover anything that is relevant to your specific needs today. Again, this session is a little bit different than the sessions I've done throughout the summer. Some of you have gotten my emails at nauseum this summer, and you know that I've had the opportunity to do about a dozen webinars so far this summer, and I've had a couple of hundred people attend these sessions, which has been absolutely incredible. And typically at those, it's an introductory seminar where I cover the basics and we go through and give some tactical, practical implementation guidelines. Well, tonight it's a little bit different. Tonight is really about how to execute the change. It's not a whole lot of philosophical stuff. This is for people that kind of already get some of it. You understand some of the major tenets of it. And it's now, how do you actually put this into practice? How do you knock down some of the walls, overcome some of the obstacles that might be in your way, and move things forward so that you can have some successful implementation that actually impacts the lives of colleagues, yourself, and kids. So it might be a little bit different. If you've attended some of the other sessions in the past, know that this is almost like that 2.0. It's okay, you've got the ideas. Now what do you do with it? I'm going to be telling you a few stories. You'll get to know me a little bit. You'll also get to know the work a little bit. I'm going to start by sharing a very real story with you to try to set the stage and to explain why we're here today. So I grew up as a military brat. I grew up as a Navy brat. My dad was he made a career out of being in the U.S. Navy, which meant I moved a lot. I actually went to 16 different schools growing up. from kindergarten through 12th grade. I was constantly moving in, and my friends were always moving out, and I was always on the go. As a result, though, I did get to live in some pretty spectacular places. I got to live in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I got to live in Virginia Beach. I got to live in Florida. I also got to spend a few years living in Hawaii on the island of Oahu. Oahu is the island that Magnum PI was on. Actually, Magnum PI was being filmed back when I lived there. It's the island where Honolulu is located, Waikiki Beach, the North Shore, Diamond Head, all kinds of cool things are on Oahu. Well, I lived on Oahu when I was in elementary school. I actually lived in the small town right in the middle of the island known as Wahiwa. Wahiwa was this interesting little place. It was a Navy base that basically had a big hill. My dad was a crypto tech, which meant he decoded messages from other countries, and he always had to be on the highest point of any piece of land. So we lived in Wahiwa, right in the middle of the island, basically on the top of a mountain, surrounded by rainforest. You had to drive 3 miles to a pineapple field to get to the base that we lived on. It was this great little place to live. We were about 30 minutes from a beach in any direction, but all around us again were rainforests. As a matter of fact, my house was right next door to a rainforest. And I remember my mom, when I was a kid, reminding me and my older sister to never go into the rainforest. She used to put the fear factor on us and would tell us that wild boars lived out there, which they did, and mongoose lived out there, and snakes lived out there. And she said, don't go out into the rainforest because danger is right behind those trees. So I would never venture off into the rainforest alone. But then there was this one Saturday, my dad, a sailor, decided he wanted to take me on a little hike. And he came to my room and asked me if I wanted to go for a hike into the rainforest with him on that Saturday afternoon. Eager little 5, 6, 7-year-old kid, whatever I was, I jumped at the chance and said, yeah, let's go. Now, we walked a little ways past our house where there was a trail. And at the marking of the trail was a sign that said, do not enter without a guide. Well, I was a little kid. My dad was my guide. I figured he knew what he was doing. He was a sailor. He knew how to navigate the rainforest. He knew how to keep us safe. Well, truth be told, my dad had no idea what he was doing. He was a sailor. He was used to being by water. He didn't know how to navigate in a jungle, but I didn't know that. 15, 20 minutes into our hike, my dad turned to me and admitted that we were lost. We had traveled maybe a mile and a half into the rainforest, and we had no idea how to get out. We were completely lost. We started wandering our way through the rainforest, and we ended up spending 8 hours lost in this rainforest until eventually 4 U.S. Marines were sent in to find us. My mom had to report us lost, and the Marines had to come in and rescue us. And I remember the entire way out, these Marines looking at my dad and scolding him and mocking him for being a sailor stepping foot into a jungle when he should have known better because he would just get lost. He should have used the guide. And it's a true story, and it's also a funny story that I think reminds me of some of the work that I get to do. Right, I get to work with schools all over the place, and there's a lot of people doing similar work. There's a lot of schools that are doing standards-based work, but a lot of them go in without a guide. And about 80% of the schools that I get to work with are schools that navigate down a path and then a couple years in start to panic and realize they're lost and they don't know where to go. So they pick up the phone and say, hey, Dave, can you help us take some next steps? Today, my goal is to help people, first of all, figure out where the trail is, to find the path, to find the roadmap, if you will, and then to also help you, regardless of where you are on your journey, to get to that next step. So if you've been navigating alone and now you feel like you're lost, or you feel like there's wild boars chasing you every step you go and you feel like you're not making any headway, don't worry, you're not alone. It happens to a lot of people. Even in paradise, you can get lost. So just know that I'm here to help you out on our journey. So let me introduce myself real quick. Let me explain who I am and who I'm not. So I want to help you understand who is leading this charge today. And I see some familiar names on the screen, which is awesome. If you're watching the recording of this, let me introduce myself. My name is Dave Schmitto, and I currently live in Pensacola, Florida. So I still consider this paradise. I'm actually looking right now across the street, and I've got a bay with dolphins jumping and gators and all kinds of cool stuff happening right across the street from me. I'm in year 25 of my educational journey. And in that time, I've had the opportunity to have literally every role you can imagine, K-20. I've been a classroom teacher. I've been a athletic director, dean of students, a principal at multiple levels. I've been an assistant superintendent. I've been a full professor. I've done a lot of different things. But this is what I get to do full time now. Now, full time, I work with schools, I work with teachers, I work with districts and systems, helping them take things to the next level. A lot of the work I do is around standards-based grading, but I also do strategic alignment and assessment work and a whole lot of other things. Who am I not? Well, I'm not a lot of things. I am not an expert on anything, and not really an expert on everything. I can guarantee you that. I'm a guy that has a lot of words, say a lot of things, but I am not a consultant. And I'll explain the difference between a consultant and a coach really quickly. I'm going to throw some numbers on the screen real quick, just so you can get a sense of what's happening in the world of education today. The first number I'm throwing on the screen, 33,255. That's the number of education consultants that the IRS currently has listed in the United States of America. 33,255 full-time education consultants in America. I tell you that because I want you to know that there are a lot of people out there that have the answers to all the things that are broken. There's a lot of people out there right now trying to make a lot of money off of people like you to say, I'm going to step in and I'm going to solve everything. I do not consider myself a consultant. I consider myself to be a coach. I don't come in and say, follow these 4 steps and everything's going to be cured. That's the job of a consultant. My job is to coach you, to stand beside you, to say, where are your pinch points? What are your goals? What are your objectives? And how can I move you forward? But still, 33,255 consultants in the world, in America today. That's crazy to me. 4 million, what does that represent? 4 million, the number of books published each year in the United States. I say that because anybody can publish a book, right? I've published 5 books. That doesn't make me an expert just because I can put some words on a page and publish it. 70 million, what does that represent? That's the number of podcast episodes currently available here in the United States today. I say this to say there are a lot of experts that want to tell you the thing to do. Today, please, 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 please push back, challenge anything that I say. I am literally just a guy hanging out in Pensacola, Florida, who has done a lot of work, who's done this work in his schools, with his staff, with his students, and have helped a lot of other schools. But just because I've done it in other places doesn't mean everything I'm saying is going to work for you. So ask the questions that are relevant to you. Push back, use your contextual cues, your contextual clues, your context to push, to challenge, to make this as enjoyable and as enriching and as informative as possible. Know that everything that we covered today is going to be just a part of the process. You could go back and you could watch this recording 100 times, but that doesn't mean that things are going to be perfect where you are. There are still going to be hurdles. There are still going to be obstacles. There are still going to be bumps in the road. Today, I'm going to give you some skills, some strategies to move you forward, but we're not going to solve everything. We're not going to overcome everything that's in the way of successful implementation. I'm hoping that we can. I'm hoping that we can get you forward. I'm hoping that we can get you a step in the right direction, but no, there'll still be some challenges. So what is SBG? Why are we here? SBG, standards-based grading. In other places, there's also standards reference grading. There's standards reference learning. There's standards-based learning. There's standards-based instruction. The basic premise is SBG covers a couple of things. Number one, standards-based grading helps us be more effective in our jobs and helps our students demonstrate more effective practices and more effective outcomes. It also, when is done well, helps us be more efficient. The goal of standards-based grading is not to make things better for kids, but harder for the adults. There are a lot of those initiatives that we see in education today where we couch it in, this is good for the kids, which means it's going to make your life miserable. SBG is designed to both make your life better and to make your life more successful and the lives of your kids. Standards-based grading revolves around the academic standards that we're all expected to teach our kids, those core competencies that we're supposed to be trying to get our kids to master and to be equipped with, as well as the SOPs and the standard operating procedures in which we operate within the standards. A lot of us understand that we're supposed to be teaching and assessing the standards. That's the easy work. The hard work is trying to create these SOPs, these standard operating procedures amongst our school, amongst our staff, amongst our team to help us effectively do SBG. I want to say something very, very clearly. There is no standard way to do standards-based grading. I'm going to say that again. There's no standard way to do standards-based grading. So you're going to hear a lot of things today, some suggestions, some leanings, some guidance, but know that it's not a rinse and repeat. This isn't something I can put on Pinterest or Teacher Pay Teacher and have everybody else just download it and say, oh, I'm just going to go do that. Again, think about your context, think about your school, think about your students, think about your needs, and figure out how it all flows together for you. Standards-based grading is one piece of a larger component, a larger paradigm shift known as competency-based instruction. Some of you might have heard of CBI. In some places, it's known as CBE, competency-based education. The idea is that we're trying to get our kids to reach a level of competence or excellence or mastery. It's a large framework. Standards-based grading is one specific component of this larger framework. It's not something that ever stands in isolation. In a lot of schools, they think they're going to jump into standards-based grading simply because they want to fix the report card. And they realize that when they do that, Pandora's box has been opened because there's a lot of other things that they now have to address that they weren't prepared for, that they weren't ready to start addressing. Things like assessment, coming up with goals and outcomes, and how to have aligned feedback and communication strategies. There's a whole lot. Today, we're going to try our best to stay within the lane of standards-based grading, although you'll see the interworkings and how everything is so connected. Within standards-based grading, I told you my goal today is to walk you down the roadmap, to show you how to do this without getting lost in the jungle, to hopefully be that guide for you, to say, here's what I consider to be the tried and true path. These are the steps that we need to take in order to effectively and efficiently implement SBG in your school, your classroom, or your system. What I'm going to be asking you to do at various times today is to try to think about, where are you entering this conversation? What on-ramp are you on right now? Maybe you're in a school, a system, or a classroom where you've already done steps 1, 2, and 3, and now you're on step 4. Awesome. So what do you need to do to get up to speed on step 4? Maybe you're at step 7. Great. What do you need to do? Or maybe you want to go all the way back to step 1 because you don't necessarily think you did that as effectively or as efficiently as you should have. I'm a firm believer that step 1 has to be completed. It has to be mastered before you can move on to step 2. Step 2 needs to be mastered before you go to step 3, so on and so forth. For those of you that follow like the Dave Ramsey approach to finances, he's got his baby steps, and you've got to complete baby step 1 before you go on to baby step 2, and baby step 2 before you go to baby step 3. These are the SBG baby steps, if you will. These are the steps that I hope you'll follow. So if you want to take a screenshot of this, feel free. Pull out your phone. Again, you're going to be seeing this over and over and over again for the next 70 to 80 minutes as I walk you through each of these steps and help identify some of the common roadblocks that people fall into. What are some of the common detours that stop your growth? As we go through this, I'm going to be asking you to focus on something known as the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. The 80-20 rule tells us that 80% of our success comes from 20% of our decisions, which means as we cover a lot of ground today, don't feel like you have to master all of it. You don't have to understand all of it. You don't have to do all of it. Try to find that one nugget that you think will maximize your value. Try to find that one thing that will give you that quick and easy win. Cotter tells us when we're trying to execute change, one of the things that we have to do is we have to identify that thing that's going to create a sense of urgency within us and within others. As you're looking at SBG, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? What's the thing that you're trying to fix? Don't try to fix everything. What's the one thing that's going to create a sense of urgency, that desire to keep moving? How can you bring a couple of people along for the ride to help you succeed and move forward? Again, you don't have to try to convince everybody in your school, everybody on your grade level, everybody on your team, everybody in your classroom, every single parent. Find that guiding team. And as we continue to go, I'm going to be asking you to identify some small wins, some small things that you can do, because this is what leads to change. As we go today, we're going to be doing a mini SWOT analysis, if you will, where we're going to be identifying the things that are already working, those strengths you have. We're going to be looking for some of the weaknesses in the system. What are some of those opportunities, those things that you can do right away without having to change the system? And then what are some of those barriers, some of those threats that are going to stop us from moving forward? We're going to be focusing on those things that we can do right away. I'm going to be telling you some of those things that you can probably schedule and wait and do later on. And I'm also going to tell you about the things that truly don't matter. Those things that oftentimes cause people to get stuck in the mud, to feel like they are completely lost and they can't move forward. But I will be here to tell you the stuff that matters and the stuff that doesn't matter. And as we go through it all, I'm going to give you the motivation, hopefully the abilities, and prompting you as we go, because that's when this stuff can take root. Is I'm going to try my best to equip you with the skills, the strategies, the mindsets to move forward, because this is the stuff that matters most for kids. Standards-based grading is the single greatest initiative to change student outcomes, to change student learning that I have seen in education in my time, in my last 25 years, because it focuses on a lot of things that research and scholarship tells us matters for kids. When we focus on standards-based grading, we focus on everything that you can see on this chart that has a little blue or yellow arrow next to it. The blue arrows are things that teachers can individually do in their classrooms, even if a system or a school or a district doesn't align, doesn't agree, and they say they are still quote unquote traditional. The yellow arrow means it's something that is going to require you to work with some other people, and I'll be walking you through some of that as well. Collectively, these things fall into amazingly high effect sizes, things that impact student learning, again, more than almost anything else that we can focus on, more than any curriculum, more than any packaged programs, more than any textbooks, more than almost anything else that is thrown before us in our schools today. We're going to be focusing on the stuff that matters most. So all of that is just a big intro so that we can jump in and start talking about standards-based grading. What is standards-based grading? The definition that I use, the working definition, SBG, standards-based grading, involves measuring progress towards mastery of academic standards using a standardized process. There are some words on here that have different colorings because I want those words to stand out. I want you to focus on progress. That's a major component. Standards-based grading is not something where we're simply going to say, here's the standard, who's got it and who doesn't got it. Standards-based grading, when done well, actually flips the tables on a lot of practices that we currently have in our schools, like formative assessments, summative assessments, thumbs up, thumbs down, got it, don't got it mindsets. It's SBG, when done well, helps us get rid of a lot of those arbitrary labels that we have on top of kids. Good kid, bad kid, smart kid, gifted kid, at risk. It helps us get rid of that and starts to target specifically individual needs for each and every kid. Again, SBG, though, has very little to do, I would almost argue nothing to do, with the symbols we put on the page. The report card is irrelevant when it comes to standards-based grading. Let me demonstrate. For those of you that aren't driving right now, I want you to look at the screen. I got a message on the screen. If anybody is so brave and they don't have to do this while they're driving, they want to drop into the chat, I'm just curious, what does this message say? When you look at this message, it's got some numbers, it's got some letters, it's got a bunch of symbols on the page. When you read it at first glance, some of you might see it 7H15, M355, 4G3. But if you look deeper, some of you, when you first look at it, might see something that reads, this message serves to prove how our minds can do amazing things, impressive things. And I think this is an interesting slide to show you because it illustrates that regardless of the symbols that we use, regardless of if we're using A, B's, and C's or 1, 2, 3s, regardless of the symbols that are on the page, our minds still infer their own meaning of the symbols. On a report card, whatever's on your papers, whatever's in your gradebook, whether you're using A's and B's and C's or 1s and 2s and 3s, others will still infer their own meaning based off of their preconceived notions. We're going to talk very little today about A's and B's and C's or 1s and 2s and 3s or whether or not you should use a 50 versus a 0. We're going to talk very little about that just at the very end because, again, that is not the major message of SBG. Where a lot of schools go wrong is they jump to this and they say, we're going to fix the report card. We're no longer going to be using points and percentages. We're going to be using a 4-point scale or a 5-point scale, or we're going to get rid of zeros and 50 is going to be our lowest score. And that's going to fix everything. And it fixes absolutely nothing because everybody still sees symbols on a page and everybody is still inferring what those symbols mean and throwing their own arbitrary labels and meanings on top of it. We're going to be talking about things that are deeper, things that are more important, things that provide us more value to the work that we do. Today, we're going to start with steps 1 and 2 on the roadmap. We're going to talk a little bit about power standards and how do we map the standards and why this is an important part of standards-based grading. What does this have to do with the work that we do? Well, it has a lot to do with the work that we do. A couple of years ago, I was serving as a full professor at Central Michigan University. I was working in the educational leadership department, training new superintendents and new principals and the master specialists and doctoral programs. And as part of my work, I had to teach some classes, but I also had to go do some scholarship and do some research. And my research interests were all encompassing this type of work. I'm fascinated by the idea of standards-based instruction and assessment and how we can align instruction to match standards and a whole lot of other things. But specifically, I was intrigued by the notion that every single year we give these big, scary state assessments in every state in America at the end of the year, and teachers get those results back on their students in the summer. And we do a couple of things with those results. Either we say, I don't understand. I taught my kids that. The scores don't represent what I taught. Or we say, I don't care. I know my kids better than any test would, right? I was intrigued by that phenomenon. So I did a study to say, are teachers really teaching that stuff that's on those tests? Are the tests really aligned to the standards and to classroom instruction? And myself and a team of others, we were able to go and examine 10,000 K-12 classrooms. 10,000 classrooms. That's a lot. And we went in and we wanted to examine what level of instruction and assessment teachers were providing to their kids in comparison to the standards that they were supposed to be assessing and instructing at. Well, in America, if we look at K-12 standards across the 50 states, 83% of the standards, K-12, kindergarten included, 83% of the standards that we are supposed to be teaching and assessing our kids at are at the application level and higher, meaning kids are supposed to be applying, analyzing, synthesizing, creating, doing stuff. However, out of the 10,000 plus classrooms that we observed, what we saw was that 76% of classroom assessment and instruction was at the understanding and recall level or below, which means we're asking kids to just memorize a bunch of stuff, or we ask kids to summarize our words. I jokingly tell people, I think it's ironic that we fail a kid if they copy off of their peers, but we give them an A when they copy off of us. And that's what happens in a lot of our classrooms, is that we teach content, but we don't teach it to the level of the standard. 83% of the standards ask kids to perform high-level, complex thinking tasks, but 76% of our instruction doesn't meet the depth and the breadth of the standard. So what we have to do is we have to say, how can we target instruction around the depth and the breadth of the standard? A standard is only standard if it's standard, which means we have to standardize our approach and our understanding of the standards. We have to make sure that we're teaching the standards to the requisite depth, which is complex. It's hard. It's difficult to do, especially when we see statistics like this. Across America today, K-12, the average teacher in our 4 core subject areas of math, science, language arts, and social studies, the average student, when we just include those 4 core subject areas, is expected to master 257 standards a year. 257 standards a year. I want you to just let that sink in for a second. If we were to throw the 3 most popular electives of music, art, and PE, that number swells to 1,431 standards. Now, just thinking about the 257, if we had 180 days in a school year, which is the average, 180 days in a school year, and if a kid was never absent, the teacher was never absent, there was never a fire drill, there was never a lockdown drill, there was never a pep assembly, there was never a field trip. If we had instruction bell to bell every single day for 180 days, that equates to us asking kids to master a standard to the requisite depth and breadth of the standard every 0.7 days. Yep, and that's just focusing on those 4 core subject areas. Every 0.7 days. That is an impossible feat. One of the reasons standards-based grading fails in a lot of places is because people who had roles like I used to have as an assistant superintendent come up with these strategies to say, I know what we'll do. We'll come up with this thing that we call a scope and a sequence, a curriculum map, where we'll take all the standards and we'll just put them on a sheet of paper And everyone will have a date. We'll tell teachers exactly when they're supposed to cover it, what day they're supposed to cover it, what day they're supposed to test it, and they'll just plow right ahead. Those are some beautiful documents. They're pretty documents. And they work for about a week or two until the first time you go to assess a kid or a group of kids and you realize that that curriculum map, that scope and sequence is now like a choose your own adventure novel. You've got some kids that were there and some kids that aren't there. And now you as the teacher have to figure out what to do. But if you don't keep moving forward, there's no way you're going to cover everything. Well, I'm here to tell you, in an SBG world, your goal is not to cover 257 standards. Because if that's the goal, tomorrow, scrap your lesson plan, go stand in front of your kids and simply read your standards to your kids, and you're done. That's not the goal. The goal is to teach to a level of mastery and competency. But it's impossible to have them teach and master 257. So what are we supposed to do? Well, the answer, we're supposed to prioritize. The reality is that every state in America and even the big assessment companies in America, the Pearsons, the College Boards, the Smarter Balance, have even NWA have the same mindset. They understand that not every standard is created equal. Some standards are more important than other standards. Some standards do require us to dig deep and hold on and say, I am not moving on until you have this, until you understand this. However, if you're able to cover all the most important ones, those big goals, those big audacious goals, then you can cover some of the less important standards. There are some standards that are worth more than others. If you give any assessment that has a weighted score, a scaled score, like the SAT where you can get a 1200, or the ACT where you can get a 25, or your local state assessment where you can get a 300 or 400 or 500, weighted scores are not the same things as percentiles or percentages. Weighted scores tells us that some things are worth more points than others. There are some standards that carry with them more weight than others. How are things weighted? How do we determine the standards that carry more weight and more value? Well, the first answer, the first step in our SBG process is to follow a protocol known as the lead protocol. What is the lead protocol? Well, the lead protocol tells us how to identify the most essential, the most important, the most powerful standards for us to teach and assess our kids. LEAD is an acronym. It stands for leverage, endurance, and depth. Leverage, any standard that you teach or assess, a standard that might be present within your grade level and your subject area, that you look at and say, ooh, this might help a student in another subject area. I teach this in language arts. If a student masters this in language arts, it will help them be successful in social studies or science. I teach this in math. It'll help them in PE or music. That is a standard with leverage. Standards that have endurance are standards that if you teach it this year, it will help a student in future years of school. It's almost a prerequisite for future knowledge. And depth simply asks us to look at, where does it fall on that hierarchy? What level of depth are we asking kids to master? Are we asking them to apply? Are we asking them to synthesize? Are we asking them to create? The higher up on the depth chart, the more value it has. I have a protocol that I could walk you through if you're curious about this, to examine how do you actually go through and look at your standards and determine which ones have the most value. And it's a pretty simple protocol. You look at your standards and you look at them in a very binary way. And you say, does it have leverage? Yes or no. Does it have endurance? Yes or no. And then what level of depth does it have? And everything gets a quantifiable value. Some standards will come out with a quantifiable value of 8 or 9 points when you follow this protocol. Others will have a value of 2 or 3 points. The ones with the most weight or worth the most points are the ones that you focus your energies on. And I tell people, if you can get 80% of your kids to master 80% of your power standards, your essential standards, your priority standards, they will be way farther ahead than the kids that focus on covering every standard. And the reason is complex, but it's also pretty simplistic. It's because you're going to be creating vertical alignment when you're focusing on the standards that have endurance. You're going to be creating that snowball effect, that exponential effect. You're going to be creating horizontal leverage as well. Horizontal value when you look at across your grade level, working on multiple subject areas, multiple disciplines, because that's how learning happens everywhere except for in schools. We learn by combining disciplines, by combining subjects. And then when we start teaching kids how to analyze and how to synthesize and how to evaluate and how to create, we're teaching complex skills that are transferable beyond standards and beyond subject areas. What we see is that schools that focus on the lead protocol end up finding way more success than anybody else. You simply look at the standard and say, how many points does it get? And then when it's all said and done, you tally them up. The schools that I work with, I'm able to share a spreadsheet with them, and we go through this process where we're actually going through in our PLCs and our subject areas, and we're having conversations. If there's a standard that you teach and you're like, I don't know if this has leverage with another subject, I don't teach another subject. We pull in the other subject matter experts and we have a conversation. We say, I think this might apply in science. Science teacher, does this help? Yes or no? I think this might help in 8th grade. I teach 5th grade. 8th grade teacher, would this help? Yes or no? And we're able to have those horizontal and vertical alignment conversations, which are powerful. And it helps us look at the standards in a standardized way, which is extremely important. When you do all of this work, what you will see in every grade level, in every subject, in every state in America, when you do this work, there is always this line that occurs. You'll end up with 10 to 12 standards that are worth a point value far and above every other standard. Those 10 to 12 become your power, your essential, your priority standards. And it shifts our mindset from thinking we have to have students master a standard every 0.7 days to now saying there's only 10 standards that I have to focus on, which means I can really spend an entire month teaching a standard to mastery. And the answer is absolutely. When you focus on the focus and you focus on the priorities and the power, magic can happen. Moving on, we'll come back to mapping the standards in a few minutes. Building progressions. I told you early on that when we're talking about standards-based grading, it's not about got it, don't got it mindsets. It's not yes, you're there, or no, you're not there. The idea behind standards-based grading is recognizing that everybody is on a continuum towards learning. Our goal in a standards-based world is not to say do you got it or don't got it, but where are you in your level of gratitude? Recognizing that everybody knows something, but what do you know and what do you still need to know? For example, on the screen right now, I have a picture of my youngest son. I'm a father of 4 incredible kids. My youngest son, he's now an 8-year-old. What you're looking at is a picture of him when he was 4 years old, back in 2020. This is actually March of 2020. My March of 2020 looked a lot like your March of 2020. It was an absolute dumpster fire. It was a cluster, but there were some silver linings that came out of it. One of the silver linings was I got to spend a lot of time at home just playing with my kids. Well, at the beginning of 2020, January of 2020, my son, Mason, my youngest son, told me that his goal for 2020, his New Year's resolution, because New Year's Day is my favorite holiday, his New Year's resolution for 2020 was that he wanted to become a bike rider. He said that year he was going to learn how to ride a bike. Well, the picture that I am showing you right now is a picture that I took of Mason March 30th, 2020. When the world had stood still, I was actually in the driveway playing basketball with my other kids when Mason called down to me and said, "Hey, Dad, can you take a picture of me?" And I took this picture. Later on that night at dinner, we're sitting around the table as a family, and Mason asked me to pull out the picture that I took and show it to my wife. And I looked at him and said, "Mason, why did you want me to take that picture?" And he said, "Because I wanted to show Mom that I met my goal." My question to you, feel free to use the chat. You can even unmute yourself if you want to, or you can just think and reflect on this. Looking at the picture that I have in front of you, this is a snapshot. This is a little piece of evidence, which is synonymous with assessment. This is an assessment. My question to you is this evidence of mastery? Is this evidence of Mason, my youngest son, mastering his goal? Is he a bike rider according to this image, according to this piece of evidence? Now, to be honest, the story that transpired when Mason said I wanted to be able to show Mom that I was a bike rider, when I pulled out this picture, I looked at Mason and I said, "Dude, no, you're not." And I laughed at him. And he started crying and he started getting sad. My wife, who's a way better person than I am, looked at him and said, "Mason, don't listen to Dad. Tell me why you're a bike rider in this picture." And he said, "Well, because I had to get my own bike out of the garage because Dad was busy." And he gave me that dirty look. "I pushed it all up and down the sidewalk and I didn't even crash it into his car and I didn't fall down one time. I put on my own helmet. I started and stopped on my own." Pretty interesting. He had a whole list of criteria that he was able to self-assess and say, look, check mark, check mark, check mark. I'm doing all the things. Now I'm looking at it in a very binary way, and I said, no, you're not. You're not a bike rider. And he looked at it and said, but look at all the things I can do. And again, I do this full time. My wife, though, way better parent, way better person than I am, looked at him and said, Mason, that's amazing. But I wonder if tomorrow you could do this with your feet on the pedals. I wonder if tomorrow you could do this with your butt on the seat. I wonder, and she added a whole list of other things that she wanted to be able to see. See, in a standards-based grading environment, a couple of things have to happen. Number one, you have to have clearly defined criteria for what success looks like. The student and the teacher, or in this case, my son and the parent, need to be on the same page. You have to have clear expectations for success. And you have to have a criteria that says, what are the things I'm looking for? In this case, my wife said, I'm looking for handlebars. I'm looking for feet on pedals. I'm looking to see forward movement. She had a whole list of things, which is the first step to say, what is the criteria within the standard? But it also presents a whole lot of other questions, because simply coming up with a checklist of got it, don't got it is a starting point, but it's not the ending point, because this also raises a few other questions. Like, when he does this, is he ever allowed to fall down? Can he have training wheels? Can he have support? Can he not have support? What size bike does he need to ride to be able to say that he's riding his bike? How far does he have to ride? Does he just have to go to the next driveway? Does he have to go around the block? Does he have to be able to go up a hill and down a hill? Bottom line is, what is riding? Right? In our own classrooms, in our own school, it's important that we come up with a standard definition for what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like. Because as we're collecting evidence, our job is not just to say, yep, you're there or you're not there. It's what can you do so that I can move you a little farther? So for example, my wife said, I want to see your hands on handlebars. I want to see you pedaling. I want to be able to see you braking. I want to see you balancing, which is great. But even those things aren't got it, don't got it. With handlebars, what if he's got two hands on the handlebars versus one hand on the handlebar? What if he's able to maintain balance with no hands on the handlebars? What about pedaling? Does he always have to be pedaling? What about pedaling going up a hill versus down a hill versus pedaling a bike that has brakes on the back versus spinning backwards? Does he need to know how to coast? Does he need to be able to use hand brakes or foot brakes? We recognize that there's a progression in these skills as well, that they're not binary. When it comes to standards-based grading, we come up with rubrics, progressions, to let us know where somebody is in the progress of learning. And this then allows us to start differentiating our instruction, our small groups, and our assessment moving forward. So I want you to think about the criteria you might have in your own head of a student riding a bike. And I'm going to ask you again. This is now Mason again. My question is Mason riding his bike here? What about here? And would it make a difference if I told you that these pictures, these videos, are him as an 8-year-old versus as a 4-year-old? How far does he have to go? Does it matter how old somebody is? Do we look at their age and say, oh, as a 6-year-old, this is the standard for you versus as an 8-year-old? Age has nothing to do with it. Grade level has nothing to do with it. A standard is only standard if it's standard. We don't say this is the standard for you. You have a little asterisk next to your name in the grade book. No, a standard is only standard if it's standard. What we have to do, though, is say, where are you according to the standard? What are all the requisite skills so that I can move you forward? Because otherwise we find ourselves caught in traps sometimes, where we see people doing things that we're not accustomed to. And because we're not accustomed to how they're doing it, we look at them and say, well, you're not doing it right. If we say, no, you have to have your feet on the pedals, and we see somebody doing something like this, we say, ooh, well, I don't know if that's mastery or not. Because I said a butt has to be on a seat. I said feet have to be on a pedal. That's not the goal. The goal is for us to say, what are the skills and dispositions? The goal is to create a rubric or progression that I say is assessment agnostic. Assessment agnostic means it's not tied to a specific way for somebody to show us the evidence. Instead of saying hands on handlebars, instead of saying feet on pedals, instead of saying being able to hit your brakes, what if we said you need to have balance, you need to show momentum, you need to show gross motor skills, fine motor skills? These are things that they could show us with different bikes in different circumstances on different terrains. We would be able to collect multiple pieces of evidence as opposed to saying you have to show me this way on this day. In a standards-based environment, we're focused on the skills, the depth, the transference, the leverage, the endurance, more than what's all that stuff. We tend to measure that stuff because it's easy for us to say right or wrong. You memorized it, you didn't memorize it. You know the spokes and you know the sprockets. You know where the seat is, you know where the pedals are, as opposed to how are we going to measure balance, momentum, and endurance? But that's the goal. The goal is for us to measure the skills as well as the content. And this plays out in our classrooms. For example, a real standard in a lot of your states reads, compare the characteristics of two texts or sources. Question, what grade level text do they need to be reading at? What text do they need to be reading at all? What if they can contrast, but they can't compare? The standard asks them to compare. Compare means find the similarities. What if all these students can do is contrast? I know, and some of you are like, oh, for this one, I would do a Venn diagram. Okay, great. Venn diagrams. Don't use Venn diagrams, number one, because nobody ever uses Venn diagrams in the real world. But if that's your approach, great. Venn diagrams ask people to compare and contrast. The standard only asks for students to compare. What sources do they need to use? Because it says text or sources. Does it have to be text? Does it have to be sources? This doesn't say text and sources. Does the response have to be written? So many questions. What about this one? Recall details from text read aloud. How many details? How many text? What text? How long does the text need to be? So many questions that we would have to articulate. A standard is only standard if it's standard. This is where that collective efficacy piece comes in too, where I said some of this you do independently and some of it you do with teams and PLCs. You help articulate what is the expectation of the standard. And then you build your progressions, you build your rubrics. And the beautiful thing about building the rubrics and the progressions is a lot of this work has already been done for us. Whether you know this or not, every single state has a version of their standards that were based off of the Common Core. You might not currently be a Common Core state. Granted, I live in Florida, and my governor tells everybody that we're not a Common Core state. The Common Core is the devil, whatever. I'm here to tell you, all we've done is we've added a few civics lessons, a few civics standards, some Florida history standards, but we are a Common Core state. The Common Core was written with the end in mind. We said, what are the skills and dispositions we want high school graduates to have? If we want those skills and dispositions in 12th grade, what do they look like in 11th grade? And what does it look like in 10th grade? What does it look like in 9th grade? And it continues to scaffold up and backwards so that we can get our students prepared by the time of graduation. And those skills and dispositions are based off of depth and complexity. The more complex skills of creation and evaluation are typically high school level skills. Those analyzing and synthesizing skills tend to be middle school level skills, so on and so forth. They are grade level dependent. Our rubrics can then be built based off of depth of complexity. You might have a standard that asks students to be able to apply. The standard says students will be able to apply this knowledge to solve blah, 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 which means in your progressions, you understand what got it looks like. What's it look like if a kid can do the standard? You also understand what's it look like if they can't quite do it to that level of depth. Well, according to our progression, right below application is understand. What if they can't understand it? Well, can they memorize? Can they recall? What do you do if they can do more than apply? Well, you look at the next grade level up, which is also the next level up in terms of depth. Above application, you have analyze, and then synthesize, evaluation, creation, so on and so forth. You build your rubrics based off of the depth of the standards. Again, I'm going quickly. I apologize. So if you're getting questions, write them down. We can pull these all out. Typically, all of that work that was just described is work that's done over the course of a school year. So if you're in a school or system, you're like, oh, I haven't done any of that yet. I feel like I'm so behind. Don't worry. That's a lot of work. Identifying the most essential standards, the priority standards, coming up with your 10 to 12, and then saying, can I build a progression for each of these so that I can collect evidence that's assessment agnostic, understanding that I can collect evidence in multiple ways to demonstrate competency and excellence and a progression of skills. That's about a year's worth of work if we're coming together at regular intervals. So for example, I'm working with a school in California right now that I've been working with for a couple of years. And I go out to this school 3 times a year for full days. And I was out there for 3 full days last year, and we just finished our progressions this August. Right now, as we're jumping in, we're moving on to the next level that I'm going to start talking about, the designing of assessments, and then the creation of report cards, and then the analyzing and so on and so forth. This is typically a 2 to 3 year process just to go through this before we start to review it and reflect on it. It's a lot of work, but that's okay. It's the important work. It's the work that helps make our lives more efficient and more effective. Level 4 on our roadmap, design assessments. I'm a big believer that in order to collect quality evidence from kids, we have to move away from the one and done approach. We can't say I give quizzes on Fridays because that's what I do. We can't say this is the day you have to learn something because I arbitrarily picked a day out of the calendar because I happen to because I have to have 3 grades in the grade book per week. I have to give you assignments. We have to move beyond that approach. I'm a big believer in the process or the protocol of 3 days with 3 ways, 3 possibilities. Kids should have to show you at least 3 times that they can do something for us to have verifiable, valid, reliable evidence that a student has actually mastered any kind of skill. They should have to show you 3 different times in 3 different ways that they can do something. Again, thinking back to that big, scary assessment that happens at the end of the year in most of our grade levels, we teach stuff. We teach a book to our kids, and then they take this big assessment and they have to read a passage from a story that we never taught them. We freak out and we say, I never taught them that story. How are they supposed to be able to apply that skill? Well, number one, because we're not teaching stories. We're not teaching textbooks. We're not teaching curriculum. We're teaching transferable skills that have leverage, depth, and endurance, which means they should be able to take any article, any artifact, and still apply the same knowledge. We're assessing kids 3 ways, 3 days with 3 possibilities. This helps us get reliable, consistent evidence of mastery. It helps us move away from looking at the mean and helps us create this thing known as a body of evidence. Very rarely in education do we have a smoking gun. Very rarely do we have that one piece of evidence that we know is going to convict, and we know beyond a shadow of doubt that this gives us evidence that a kid knows or doesn't know. Because evidence, assessments, artifacts, if you really think about what they are complex. They're man-made artifacts that we're using to try to measure electrical impulses taking place inside of a child's head. Because that's what knowledge is. Knowledge is literally the firing of electrical impulses inside of somebody's head. And we've created this man-made artificial tool that we're using to say, what's happening inside your brain? And we expect it to be 100% reliable every single time. No, it's not going to be. Assessment is an art form. Assessment is an art form where we're always saying, yeah, but. We're always looking and saying, but what else do I need to know? My belief is that we need to collect at least 3 pieces of evidence to ever have anything that we consider to be valid and reliable. What does this look like? Well, I'm going to show you a lot of different possibilities. These are actual artifacts that people have shared with me and things that they've done. I've seen teachers that, for example, this is a math example, that they've got their rubric, they've got their progression. They focus on one individual row on the rubric at a time, one horizontal line, one individual skill. And they give an assessment to the students where they say, I'm going to ask 2 or 3 questions just based off of your level 3 competencies, just your level 3 skills. If you get those incorrect, I'll give you level 2 questions. If you get the level 2 questions incorrect, I'll give you level 1 questions. I'm going to start with the level 3, and if you get that correct, I'll give you level 4 questions. We start with the standard because we don't believe that kids have to climb the ladder to success. I've seen a lot of protocols that have kids climbing the ladder and starting with low-level understanding before they're ever able to attempt mastery of the standard. What that does is a couple of things. Number one is it eliminates your ability to be efficient. It also disconnects us from the standard. Because in a lot of instances, recall and understanding tasks have nothing to do with application and synthesis tasks later on. For example, my kid riding his bike, does he have to know the difference between a spoke and a sprocket? Does he have to be able to label a diagram of a bike before he gets on and rides the bike? No. But if he's not able to ride the bike and I say, put your feet on the pedals, and he says, I don't know what a pedal is. Oh, now I need to teach you what a pedal is. But I don't have to have him jump through that hoop and prove to me he knows all the vocabulary and all the definitions before he can actually go do the standard. What happens in a lot of schools is kids get stuck on the mundane details, and they never get to the depth of the standard because it takes them so long to master things that aren't part of the standard. For example, myself, I was a language arts and social studies teacher. Social studies, I can get into an amazing debate with you about constitutional law. I can debate any amendment with you and talk to you about the validity of it, but I cannot memorize dates or names to save my life. Memorizing information is not a prerequisite to applying and analyzing information. So we start with the standard and we say, if you can't do the standard, what can you do? And we work backwards from there. This is an example. The teacher starts off, they don't have to grade an entire paper of 50 problems. They say, let's take 2 or 3 at the level 3. And if you can do it, great. If you can't, let's see what you can do. And they start to work down until they find their perfect center. I've seen other people that create assessments like this. They have an assessment, and at the very bottom of it, they've got their rubric. This is a teacher that decided the 4-point rubric was too complex for them, so they had a 3-point rubric. Again, not going to split hairs. I'll talk about this later on. And on theirs, they had the standard, and they said, with this item, I'm going to be able to identify with this test item, is a student beginning, developing, or secure. They've got their rubric directly tied to their assessment. They understand that every single item on their assessment is an assessment in and of itself. Every question you ask a student, every artifact you collect from a student is an assessment of their learning. Assessments aren't these artificial things that happen on Fridays. They are things that happen all day, every day in our classrooms when we're making instructional decisions based off of what you know or what you don't know. There are lots of ways to collect evidence. This is an example of a teacher I'm working with right now from the state of Indiana. We're working on an entire year-long body of evidence plan, where we've moved ourselves forward, where we said, what are all the standards we're focused on? What instructional units do they fit in? How are we going to collect all of that evidence throughout the course of the year so that we have a full body of evidence? How can we make sure that we're coming up with multiple ways for kids to show these things? We're going through and we're analyzing every single assessment that we offer to kids, every single menu of choices for the kids to say, does this work for everybody? I'm working with Pasco County, Florida, a large school system with 130 schools. And we've come up with an entire standards-based grading initiative and an entire pathway forward where we've recognized that kids have to have multiple timelines, multiple opportunities, multiple ways to show us what they know. We understand that not every single standard is of equal importance. And we understand that this is a long process, that it takes a lot of work to move things forward. And if all of that is extremely overwhelming for you, you're saying, Dave, can we go back to that Pareto principle, the 80-20? You said if things get too complex, just focus on some simple things. Can you give me something simple? Here's something simple. Here's a starting point. Here's a great way to start the change of your assessment practices. If you're a teacher, like I was, when I was a classroom teacher, I did a lot of things wrong. And in my classroom, every Friday was used for 2 things, tests or movies. If there wasn't a TV cart rolled into my room, kids knew they were taking a test. And I wrote my tests on Thursday night. I would sit at home watching ER, Friends, and Seinfeld, and I would say, what did I teach the kids this week? And I would write down questions to ask my kids on Friday. Horrible practice, right? Horrible practice. But if that's you, no shame. I'm still going to allow you to give your little quizzes every single Friday. My quizzes were always 5 questions or 10 questions, not because that's more mathematically valid, but because it was easier to make a grade out of, right? I wanted to be able to come up with points and percentages that were easy to turn into letter grades. I'm not even going to stop you from doing that. So if you're a teacher that gives quizzes every single Friday, feel free to give a quiz this Friday. Feel free to give a 10-question quiz this Friday. But here's what I'm going to challenge you to do. Your first 6 questions that you ask your kids, I want those 6 questions to be based off of the present. What are the things that you taught this week? What standard, what objectives, what were the big things that you wanted to ask your kids this week? But then I also want you to ask 2 questions on stuff that you already taught, stuff that they should have already mastered, stuff that they should have already learned. At this point in the school year, it's early in the year, you can even ask based off of stuff they should have learned last year. And then I also want you to ask 2 questions about stuff you haven't even presented yet. Stuff that's scheduled for later on in the year. And you might be thinking, well, Dave, that's not fair. Number one, how are you expecting kids to remember things that they were taught last year? Well, the goal is for kids to remember things up until adulthood. If you're teaching things this year that you don't expect them to know next year, number one, don't teach it. That should be a good reflective moment for you to say, maybe this doesn't have the endurance that's necessary. If you're teaching things in September that they don't need to know in March, April, and May, don't be shocked when they don't know it when it's time for the big scary test. It's important for us to constantly assess, do they still know this? Did I teach this to the requisite depth for them to hold on to? And then I also want you to do that preview. I want you to figure out what they know before you teach it, because it's our own arrogance that says a kid can't know anything until I've taught it. Sometimes kids walk into your room and they already know stuff. And guess what? If they know it before you taught it, you just bought yourself the gift of time, because now you don't need to spend all your time and energy teaching that stuff to that kid. Yep, I want all of these things to be scored, and I want them all to be scored equally. And that plays into something we're going to be talking about later on. But I want you to start collecting evidence to say, what do you know? What do you still know? And what do you need to know? That is the goal of every assessment. Where are you in the process? And is there any endurance? Again, I'm not saying this is the answer. This is a stepping stone to get you to start looking at assessments differently. The purpose of assessment is not just to document right or wrong. The purpose of every assessment is to say, what do you know, so that we can ... I made a provocative statement early on and said one of the things we do wrong is saying there's formative assessments and summative assessments. There is no scholarship or research that says anything to that sort, other than people like me that just write random books. Some people have written books about that, but there's no scholarship or research to support it. What the scholarship and research tells us is that every quality assessment is used formatively and summatively, which means it's used to document evidence of performance and used to plan for future instruction. So get yourselves in the place where you're like, I need to start documenting student performance so that I can ... whatever that ... is. That then leads us into creating report cards, which I've circled in blue because we'll come back to that. We'll cover report cards. And then this whole conversation about revising and retakes and redos and all of those other things that come into the conversation. I'm going to go quickly through this because I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure I can just cover these so you understand them. And then we can talk about the obstacles, hurdles, and how to overcome. So what are some of these things that we want to talk about? First of all, let's talk about this idea of retakes, redos, and having multiple assessments. Some of you have heard me say things like the mean is mean. Too many report cards are based off of the mean. We typically know that as the average. We look at all the scores and you divide them by the number of possible scores to come up with a final grade for a kid. Well, let me just walk you through an example real quick so I can show you how it's mean. I want you to, for just a minute, pretend that your school has just come up with this new innovative class that they're going to be teaching to try to encourage kids to show up for school. You're going to be teaching a skydiving class to kids this year. And you have so many kids register that your class is only a 6-week class because you got to just start rifling through kids. At the end of every week of your class, you give your kids the same quiz. And the quiz is, can you pack a parachute? And you grade your kids. At the end of 6 weeks, your kids have a final exam. And because our school is really into hands-on learning and proficiency-based instruction, it's a skydiving class. At the end of the 6 weeks, your kids are going skydiving. I also understand that in states all across America, teachers are tied to the performance of their kids, metaphorically and literally. A child's success is a teacher's success. If a student performs, teachers are rewarded, and vice versa. So at the end of a 6-week course, yes, kids are going skydiving, but so are you. As a matter of fact, you are going to be tandem skydiving with one student. Because if I'm your administrator, I give you lots of choice in things. I'm going to allow you to choose the student from your class that you go skydiving with. And I want you to pretend that the 3 students that are on the screen in front of us are the 3 students that you are debating between. The numbers that are on the screen represent the scores that those students have earned every Friday on their quiz of packing their parachutes. You get to look at their scores, you get to look in the gradebook and choose one of these students to jump out of a plane with. Student A, student B, student C. You're going to be using their parachute and their skills to help you hopefully make a successful landing. When you look at these 3 kids, some of you might say, oh, I'm choosing student C. Look at them. They're at a 95 at the end of this. Some of you might look at student B and say, oh, 62%. I'm not doing that. Student C, I don't know what your rationale is, but you have to choose one of these kids. The reality is, if you were to look in your gradebooks and most of your gradebooks for these 3 kids, at the end of the 6 weeks, all 3 of these kids would have the exact same grade. Because all 3 of these kids, when you average their scores together using the mean, end up with a 62. And that's what I mean by the mean is mean. The mean doesn't tell us the whole story. Some people might say I'm choosing student C because look at that growth, look at that progress. Some people might say I'm choosing student A because they knew all this stuff before they had to take the same stupid quiz every single week or before I confused them. Some people might say I'm choosing student B because at least it's consistent. I can say bye to my loved ones. I can sign my will before I go, whatever the case may be. But the stories are not the same. Using the mean is not an effective way to demonstrate progress towards mastery. When we understand that, it takes the whole idea of retakes and redos and what's ethical and what's fair to a whole nother level. Because we're not trying to manipulate an average grade. Instead, we're trying to make sure that we are telling an accurate story. We want to make sure that the narrative that we're showing with our grades shows progress, shows mastery, shows the process of learning in the fairest, clearest, most disaggregated way possible. When I was here, let me share this a different way. When I was a school principal, I had the expectation for myself that I was going to observe every single teacher in my building at least 12 times a year. At least 12 times a year, I was going into teachers' classrooms to observe them. And don't worry if you hear that and you're like, oh my gosh, never in my world. There were lots of teachers that said that same thing to me, and I would jokingly tell them, don't worry. That means I'll come into your classroom one time this year, and it's going to be that one day when you show up late and you've got coffee all over your blouse and your dog just died. My goal was never to use an observation as a gotcha. My goal was to say, I want to collect the most evidence I can so I can see the most accurate picture and representation of what you can do. I don't want to just show up that one day when the red carpet is out. I don't want to show up that one day when you've got coffee all over your blouse and you ran late and your dog died. I want to be able to see the good, the bad, the ugly, because I'm trying to come up with a body of evidence to tell a compelling story. But I'm also a believer that consistency and recency matters more than frequency. I'm not taking all of your observations and averaging them together. A real life story. I had two teachers that were best friends one year. Their names were Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Smith. Their real names were Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith, I went into her classroom 12 times throughout the course of the year. At the school I was at, we had to evaluate our teachers using a 22 indicator rubric. 22 things were on a rubric, and teachers could get scores of 1, 2, 3, or 4 for each of those 22 indicators. The 1, 2, 3, 4 meant ineffective, minimally effective, effective, or highly effective. When I went into Mrs. Smith's classroom, those 12 times in her space, 9 times that I went into her room, her observation scores came out in the effective range. The last 3 times I was in her classroom, her scores were in the highly effective range, the 4 out of 4. I want you to focus on this real quick. 9 times her scores were a 3 out of 4. The last 3 times her scores were 4 out of 4. At the end of that year, when I sat down and had my observation conference with her, my end of year debrief, and we were talking through things, Mrs. Smith and I talked through the highs, the lows, and all the feedback. And ultimately, I told her that at the end of the year, she was going to be getting a 4 out of 4 highly effective from me. At first, she didn't understand it. She said, what are you talking about? I only got a highly effective 3 times. And I explained to her, yeah, but you're showing it to me now. I'm seeing a consistent and recent pattern of performance. I also explained to her that I have a huge ego, because when I said what she was getting, I said, can you believe that we did this? Because she took a lot of the feedback that I gave her, and I explained to her that we did this together. She was able to get a 4 out of 4 because, wow, I must be this amazing teacher of teachers, and you couldn't do this before me, but now look what you can do. Because ultimately, that's what happens in our classrooms, right? Kids are supposed to get better and smarter and gain more understanding the more time they spend with us. So why shouldn't we put more emphasis on the things that are more recent and, again, more consistent? Now, her teaching buddy next door, Mrs. Jones, I had to meet with her after the weekend. I met with Mrs. Smith on a Friday. I met with her teaching buddy, Mrs. Jones, the following Monday. Word had already spread from Mrs. Smith to Mrs. Jones how this was going to work. If you look at Mrs. Jones' scores, same mathematical principle, 9 out of 12 of her scores were effective, 3 out of 4 were highly effective. But after a long, awkward conversation with Mrs. Jones, I had to explain to Mrs. Jones that, yes, mathematically, their scores were the same, but I wasn't seeing the same pattern of performance. Mrs. Jones, at the end of the year, ended up with a 3 out of 4 effective from me, because I did not see consistent and recent evidence of performance. I explained to her that when I'm collecting evidence, I'm not looking for the mean. I'm not looking for the mode. I'm not looking for the median. I'm looking for consistency and recency of evidence. I'm looking for patterns that show progress. And I didn't see it. Now, there's more to the story where grievances were filed. I actually won the grievances. This ended up changing the entire law in the state in which I worked at this time, which was an amazing thing that happened as a result of this. But this is actually the same thing that happens on any adaptive test that your students are presented with today. If your kids have to take the NWA MAPS assessment or a Smarter Balance assessment, those assessments where the kids are answering questions and it looks like everybody's answering different questions because the questions are getting harder and easier based off of the kid. Adaptive assessments follow the principle of consistent and recent evidence. Students have to show patterns of consistent excellence in order for the questions to progress to harder questions. Similarly, if students show consistent and recent patterns of underperformance, the questions get easier. Consistency and recency matters more than frequency. What does this look like in gradebooks? It looks a lot of different ways. Maybe you're in a school where you are using rubrics and you've got 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s, and you say that 3s and 4s are proficient or good. Maybe you've got the standards written in your gradebook instead of assignment names. And when kids are able to show you 3 times that they've earned 3 or 4s, you no longer have to assess kids on that standard anymore. You no longer have to collect evidence because they've already demonstrated. But kids that are still struggling, still have those 1s and 2s, you're providing that differentiated, targeted instruction to them. And when they actually get it, they get it, regardless of when they get it. Maybe you're check, minus, check, plus. Maybe you are in a binary mindset of got it, don't got it, and you've identified what got it looks like. 3 got it's, and you're good. Maybe you are still using points and percentages. Okay. Can you identify how many points or percentage points a student has to earn for you to think that they've got it? And once they've got it, you've seen a recent consistent pattern of excellence, you can move on and no longer have to assess them on that. This manifests itself in a lot of different ways. I had a math teacher who said that they didn't assign 20 problems to their kids. They instead said that they assigned 3 problems to their kids. If you were able to get questions 1, 2, and 3 right, you were done. But if you couldn't get questions 1, 2, and 3 right, you'd come up and you'd get some feedback and some support. Then you'd go try questions 4, 5, and 6. When you get those right, great, you're done. If not, you go questions 7, 8, 9. You keep on going. And whether or not you answered questions 18, 19, and 20 correct, or questions 1, 2, and 3 correct, you end up with the same grade. Because the grade is based off of your mastery and your competency, not how long it took you to get there. This manifests itself in a lot of different ways as well that just becomes extremely fun. I was working with a school in Ohio where we created these individual rubrics and individual grade levels and individual subject areas. And the teacher started to recognize that pattern that I was showing you, that I mentioned about the increasing complexity of the verbs and the skill sets within themes. And it started with a middle school social studies class where a middle school social studies department that recognized that every single year they were teaching the same sorts of things through different lenses. One teacher might be US history, another one might be world history, another one might be ancient civ, but they were all teaching economics and government and history and various components. So what they did is instead of having a 4-point rubric, for grades 6, 7, and 8, they came up with one big 8-point rubric. And in their 8-point rubric, they had the agreement that the 6th grade teacher would cover areas 1, 2, 3, and 4. The goal was to get 80% of the kids to at least that level 3. The 7th grade teacher then, knowing that 80% of the kids were beginning at that level, began instruction at level 3 and covered areas 3, 4, 5, and 6, with the understanding that 80% of the kids would be at level 5. The 8th grade teacher then began with 5, 6, 7, 8, with the understanding that 80% of the kids would get to that level 7. This started in a middle school social studies department, and then it spread to language arts where they realized, hey, we do the same thing. We're all teaching reading, writing, speaking, informational text, narrative text. We're doing the same thing, and they did the same thing. Mathematics realized that they're teaching numeracy and algebraic expressions, and then they did the same thing. And then in science, they realized that they were all teaching life forms and chemistry. They were all doing the same thing. So they all came up with an 8-point rubric. The district heard about this and said, why is this just happening at the middle school? And it spread down to the elementary. The high school eventually caught on and said, wow, they're coming all the way through the system with this. Can we do this too? And this district now has a 22-point rubric that goes from 12th grade down to kindergarten. So every report card looks the same with the same outcomes, just a greater depth of complexity every single year, which is powerful. It allows them to differentiate when they say a kid is working at a grade level above or a grade level below, it actually means something. It allows teachers to have amazing vertical collaboration. When they're collecting evidence in 7th grade, they can make sure that it meets the expectations in 8th grade, in 9th grade, or 5th grade. It just the impact is exponential, and we're seeing some incredible things happen. Again, this looks a lot of different ways in a lot of different places. I'm at a place now with a school where we've covered all of those things, and they're now saying, can you come in and actually tell us if our instruction is aligned? Are we doing all the things that we need to do? And I'm able to go in and give walkthroughs with the principals, with the instructional coaches, using an aligned form where we're looking for all of these practices in action, as well as communication, aligned goals, targeted assessment, grading practices, opportunities for retakes and redos. And we've got a form where we're able to align everything to say, are things working? And I'm here to tell you they are. I'll show you the results in just a minute. All that being said, I did say at the very end, we would talk a little bit about grading. So what does grading have to do with all of this? It is called standards-based grading, but we haven't even talked about it yet. What are some of the guiding principles of grading? Again, lots of ways to do this. A standard is only Stanford standard, but there's no standard way to do standards-based grading. Things to recognize. This screen, when I'm done, will be something you might want to take a picture of. Number one, consistency and recency matter more than frequency. Don't look at the frequency of correct responses, aka the percentage correct. The percentage doesn't tell us whether or not there's consistent and recent expectations. If a student gets a 95% on their backpack project, for example, where they're packing a parachute in a backpack, 95% might seem like a good grade, but what if that 5% was actually the art of putting the parachute in the backpack? It's all folded correct, the cords aren't tangled, but they forgot to put it in. That's why they lost 5 points. Now, that frequency grade doesn't necessarily mean as much unless we're confident that every question, every item is equally aligned and equally as valid. Consistency and recency matters more than frequency. If you're at this place where you're like, but I have to use an average, I can't just go and focus on 3 in a row. Here's my recommendations. The mode is greater than the median is greater than the mean. What is the mode? The mode means the most evidence. What do you see the most evidence supporting? Do you see when you collect evidence from kids, most of the time they show that they've got it? Most of the time? That's better than the median. What's the median? The median is when you take all of their attempts and you say, I'm going to take the middle response, which is still better than taking the mean, which also uses the worst response, the worst artifact against them when they later on learned it. So if you have to use an average of some sorts, which again, consistency and recency matters better than frequency, but if you have to use frequency, some sort of average, mode is greater than median is greater than mean. I also use the principle of 4 is greater than 5 is greater than 2 is greater than 100. What does that mean? It means the points that you assign to tasks. I use 4-point rubrics. Why do I use 4-point rubrics? For a lot of reasons. Number one, first reason is because a 4-point rubric cannot be translated into letter grades. We can't say a 4 is an A, a 3 is a B, a 2 is a C, a 1 is a D, because now what happens? There's no F. How's a kid ever going to fail? That doesn't work. You're right. It doesn't work. So we can't just do that translation. However, some people try to do that translation. I see a lot of high schools that already use 4-point scales all the time in GPAs, right? They're already using GPAs. They're already taking points that they're turning into percentages, that they turn into letter grades, that they later turn into a 4-point scale. So just skip all that and go straight to a 4-point scale. A 4-point scale is better than a 5-point scale because 5-point scales get confused where people say a 5 is an A, a 4 is a B, a 3 is a 2, which isn't what we're saying at all. But that's better than a 2-point scale, which is simply got it, don't got it, because at least with a 5-point scale, you've got a progression. A 2-point scale where you're saying got it, don't got it, isn't good, but it's better than a 100-point scale where you've got 100 degrees of gottitude, which it's almost impossible to disaggregate 100 points of progress. So 4 is greater than 5 is greater than 2 is greater than 100. Whew, that's a math problem for you. And then regression is greater than replacing is greater than recalculating. Today, I had somebody that sent me a question and they wanted to know about this, the idea of replacing grades in the grade book. Is it ethical to change grades or not ethical to change grades? And my principle is regression is greater than replacing is greater than recalculating. What do I mean by that? Grade regressions mean as you add grades to a grade book, old grades fall off. Every major grading package, grading program available, whether you use FACS, Focus, PowerSchool, have regressive grading as an application that you can use. which means you add a new grade to a standard. The oldest grade no longer calculates. Every time you add a new one, an old one falls off. It's called regressive grading. That is better than replacing a grade. Replacing a grade means a kid struggled early on. Now they know it. You simply go back and change the grade, which is still better than recalculating a grade, which I'll talk about. Why is regression better than replacing? Replacing loses the story. The idea is to have an accurate story. If you're always focused on the most recent consistent evidence, don't worry about what the other evidence shows, but you want to make sure it's still there so that you can capture the progress, because you want to be able to tell the story and show the progress. When you simply replace the grade, you can no longer see the progress. But that's better than simply recalculating a grade. What is recalculating a grade? Recalculating is almost like using a frequency, and a kid gives another attempt, you just throw another grade at the end, and you say, I'm going to come up with a new average. You took another attempt, I'm going to throw it another grade at the end, and now it's going to be another new average. And you're constantly re-averaging, recalculating just based off of new evidence. So my principles: regression is better than replacing, is greater than recalculating. 4 is greater than 5, is greater than 2, is greater than 100. Mode is greater than median if it's greater than mean. And then consistency plus recency equals frequency. Remember, there's no standard way to do standards-based grading. Your goals are to clearly communicate and clearly articulate progressive mastery of standards to others using a standard operating procedure. But your community and your context is unique. You know what your class, your students, your teachers, your community values. So it's important for you to take this and run with it and use it in the most effective way possible. In summary, what do you do next? Well, you pick a standard or standards to focus on next month. I'd say think about this through the lens of October. What standard or standards would you really want to focus on? To say 80% of my kids are going to be masters or competent in this standard. What passions, interests, and curiosities of your students can you involve, so that you're not just looking at this through the lens of one assessment, one task, one thing that interests you, but you're really involving your students in this process, coming up with a menu, a selection of choices, so that you can actually break it down and say, I know what 4 steps of the progress towards mastery looks like. And I'm going to collect evidence in at least 3 different ways to show competency and mastery. If you can do that next month, you are far and away ahead of the game, because that's the heart and soul of standards-based grading. You've got the standards, you understand it's a progress, that it's progress towards a process of mastery. You're collecting multiple pieces of evidence to tell a compelling story so that you can communicate that to others. And then ultimately, allow this to generate the creative juices within you. Have fun with it. Engage kids in a meaningful way. Collaborate with your peers vertically and horizontally, because that's where the magic happens. Again, I told you this was going to be a quick dive. Take the 20% of things that we talked about and try to make some amazing results happen. Try to find some people that are invested in this process with you. Celebrate some short-term wins. Find some things to do, some things not to worry about. Focus on your priorities. Prompt yourself, throw some things on the calendar and say, I'm going to do this tomorrow. I'm going to do this in October. Put some things out there so that you're not just sitting here in a webinar for nothing. Make a commitment and do something with this work, because it does work. I told you I go in, I do all kinds of classroom feedback surveys. I've been able to go in literally thousands of classrooms. And what we've seen going through thousands of classrooms over the last 10 years of this work is that those schools that are extremely committed to this work, when we go through and we look at progress of mastery on a very real way, when we go through and we quantify all of these things, don't worry about the 2s and the 4s and the 7s and all of that. I could break that down for you if anybody's curious about this. But what we've seen is that the schools that implement this for 2 or 3 years, that get their teachers to a level of competence on an 8-point scale of all of these components that I just mentioned, are showing success that outperforms about 95% of other schools of similar demographics and similar students. Teachers that tend to average a 4 on an 8-point scale of their competence and their confidence in all of these things, after about 2 years, end up outperforming about 60% of other schools. Schools that dabble in this and they say, oh, that's cool, and I'm going to try some of this, tend to outperform the average barely, but I'm also a big believer that you can focus on anything and see a little bit of success. If you really dial down and you really focus on this, really focus on all of the essential components, you will outperform everybody and you'll blow people away. So lots of ways that I can help, lots of ways that I can support you, but you can also support each other. So lean in and do the work. Find the things that matter to you, dial in, and focus on your on ramp. Regardless of where you are, take it to the next level. That being said, want to have a few minutes here. If you do have any questions and you want to unmute yourself or you want to drop them in the chat, anything that you came here and you're like, okay, but I need to know the answer to this because I'm stuck and I need to take things to the next level. Does anybody have a specific question that they want help with? And I'll actually stop recording now just in case that is going to hinder anybody from sharing. So thank you for putting up with the recording. I'm stopping that now.